Today is October 24th, 2024. This is episode 54 of the In a Nutshell podcast. I'm your host, Sean Vowells, and as usual, I am joined by Joe Meade. Tonight, Joe and I will get started with our Big Ten basketball preview. We'll go over the first 9 teams, some expectations, roster schedules, and then whether we have them in our all-conference teams. So, Joe, this might be a little bit messy. We're giving this a go for the first time, but we're going to go in alphabetical order like we have for football, like we have for basketball now for a couple years, and that means in the Big Ten, we are starting with the Illinois Fighting Illini. Brad Underwood is back after a pretty successful season. They got over the hump. They got to the second weekend. But, Joe, it's almost an entirely different roster. Now, that might not be a bad thing because there is a ton of talent on this team, whether it's some highly sought-after freshmen, especially from the international market, or some highly ranked transfers in Trey White and Ben Humrikas. But first, Joe, before we get into it even clearer, what are the expectations for Underwood and the Illini this year?
Sean, I think pressure-wise, this is the least amount of pressure he's probably ever going to feel at Illinois. The way he described it at Big Ten Media Day, I think was perfect. And I think at the end of his season last year, they were a Final Four team that played UConn in the Elite Eight. And it's really hard to argue that, although they were pretty close with them until that 30-0 run that's gone pretty viral as of now. So, Sean, I think a lot of people now trust Brad Underwood based on where they've come in the preseason polls, whether it's been in the Dispatch or various independent journals. That's because Brad's put together rosters. I think he's having a lot more fun with it. You see a lot of coaches complain about it, particularly in football and really in basketball. I mean, that's why you're seeing guys like AKA a Tony Bennett retiring now. I think Brad's kind of embraced that, and really good for him. Expectation-wise, I think they're going to be high as ever, although I think he's going to have a bit of that cushion considering the season they had last year. He's now won multiple Big Ten tournament titles, a regular season title. I think the one crown jewel is missing, Sean, is that Final Four. I think with this roster, it's definitely possible. I wouldn't put it in the realm of likely as of now, but I would say the addition of Boswell, I think you're going to have to rely on a lot of these freshmen, whether it's Yakonis from Lithuania, whether it's a Will Riley. He's projected to score 11 points a game for them on Bart Torvik. So I think if one of those freshmen can really pop off to help the combo of Ty Rodgers and Kylan Boswell, this could be a really dangerous team, not only in the conference but in the country. But I do think you're going to have that rough period at the beginning of the year where they're going to be figuring it out.
Yeah, and those watching the YouTube can see the roster here. And, you have a 3 really highly sought-after freshmen, 3 transfers. You get Ty Rodgers back. And, Brad Underwood, as coach, maybe lessens a few nerves about this roster. There aren't, every coach isn't going to do well with this roster, but there's 2 things, that's for sure. There's talent, and then there's Brad Underwood, and usually that matches up pretty well. So, Joe, we'll scroll down real quick here to their schedule, and we will go through them more in depth at a later date, but anything really stand out to you? They do have the Bama game on a neutral, Arkansas on a neutral in the non-conference, Tennessee at home, and then if you look all the way down there at the bottom, they do play Duke in a neutral in February. So certainly not an easy start for the Illini, and while they might not look their best early on, they're certainly going to find out.
Yeah, Sean, and I think the schedule, and we're going to be going through these a lot, especially as the season begins. The schedule provides ample opportunity to get these quad one wins. Like anything, there's chances to lose, but I'm really looking at the Bama and Arkansas games. I think those are 2 games on a neutral floor. They're not likely to win, but I wouldn't be stunned at all if they picked one off, particularly the Arkansas game on Thanksgiving. So, really interesting schedule. I think they will learn very quickly what kind of team they are before Big Ten play, when they play at Northwestern and then home against Wisconsin. So, I don't think Illinois' program is under question anymore. I think those questions were very few and far between before last year. They were a lot louder 2 years ago, but as of now, I think Illinois is the kind of program that's going to be playing these marquee games on neutral floors, and teams with national championship aspirations are going to keep a second eye on Illinois in hopes they don't face them in the NCAA tournament.
So now, Joe, that's pretty much it for their roster, their schedule. It's no use in really going through their Big Ten strength of schedule because everybody plays everybody once, and you play three teams twice. Now, it stinks if you get the three best teams, but really, with how uncertain this conference is, there's no point in really going through that and saying how tough of a Big Ten schedule it is. So here, let's put them in to our power rankings. So, Joe, where do you have the Illini?
I have the Illinois Fighting Illini in fifth place. I do want to caveat that with I think they will enter the Big Ten tournament one of the better teams. I do think they're going to struggle a bit at the beginning, just with the new roster and particularly the three freshmen that are going to have to contribute. But I do have them in fifth.
Well, Joe, this might shock you a little bit, but I've got them all the way up in second. I just can't really separate really the top four, maybe the top three. And I do think the Illini are going to be really good at the end of the year, and they might be the 4 seed, but they might be the second best team in the conference. So I've got the Illini second. You have got them fifth. Now, Joe, will you be filling in any of your first or second team spots here?
I will, Sean. I think Kylan Boswell, the transfer from Arizona, is going to have not quite the impact Terrence Shannon had, albeit a totally different position. I do think Brad Underwood is going to elevate his game. I think his minutes are going to have to go up from the 27 he averaged at Arizona. I do think he helps this roster a lot, and I think he's going to have to be a leader on this roster along with a Ty Rogers. I think a lot of these freshmen are going to have to feed off of him, and I think he's going to do just that, especially late into the year, which is why I'll have him on my second team.
Okay, is that it for Illinois
That's
for
it.
you?
Yep.
All right. Well, I have a different player on the first team. Now, this is I did want to throw one major curveball here onto the first team because there are a lot of solid players, and I'm going to go with the Lithuanian freshman Kasparas Jakishonis, and I'm just looking to make sure I spell this right so I don't get anybody in trouble. And he is my first name on the first team. So Kasparas Jakishonis on my first team. Kylan Boswell makes your second team. And that is it for me for Illinois. So, Joe, unless you've got something else to say, let's move on to the next one.
I'm all ready, Sean.
All right. So up next, in alphabetical order, is the Indiana Hoosiers' Mike Woodson, back after a majorly disappointing year. They do return their core of players from a year ago, Malik Renew, Mackenzie Mbako, and Trey Galloway, and they do bring in one of the best transfer hauls in the country between Miles Rice, Cannon Carlisle, Umar Ballo, and Luke Goody. So, Joe, didn't go well last year for Indiana, but with the amount of money that they've put into this team, expectations are going to be really high.
Yeah, Sean, I think expectations justifiably are high. I think the way the football program's turned it around, albeit that's kind of a ridiculous analogy to make, in 1 year, it speaks volumes. Indiana football is probably on the verge of being in a 12-team playoff conversation. Indiana basketball, let's face it, Sean, they haven't been close to the Sweet 16 since they made it in 2016. That's unacceptable for the premier program of the Big Ten Conference. Now that UCLA is in there, we can have the debate. Doesn't really matter. They're the premier basketball program in the conference. And I think anything short of a second weekend trip or hanging a banner is going to be a major disappointment for the Hoosiers, especially with this roster.
Yeah, it's incredibly talented, and also add 5-star Bryson Tucker into the mix there. Joe, they have probably 10 solid players that could see the court at times, and you still have Anthony Leal, fifth-year senior, who played huge minutes last year and ended up getting that tip in against Penn State in the tournament. Now, they have a lot of talent, which might hurt their chances to have a Big Ten Player of the Year and no definite star. But, Joe, where do you have the Hoosiers in the power rankings?
Sean, this is a really tough one. I'm going to put Indiana in second place.
All right.
I think their combo of young talent, new talent, and veteran talent, particularly Malik Renew, bringing back a Trey Galloway, Mackenzie Mbako, who I think is really going to step up this year. You add those with an Umar Ballo, and some of these freshmen, a Bryson Tucker, even a Gabe Cupps off the bench. Having guys like that in certain games late in the year when they're banged up is going to be key. So Hoosiers in second place for me.
Joe might be a homer, but I'm putting him in first. I just think there's too much talent, and I don't think it's going to take a crazy amount of games to win this league this year. Maybe 14, definitely 15. You're not going to see a 19-1 sort of team this year. And I do think Indiana is the most talented team, and I don't think that's that hot of a take. And they've got some shooters in the door. Carlisle from Stanford, Goody from Illinois, Tucker can shoot it, and then you hope Galloway and Mbako, Rice can shoot it too. So that was their Achilles heel last year, and at least it seems like they've tried to address it. So the Hoosiers first for me, and second for you. Now, Joe, will you be adding any players to your all-conference team?
The politically correct thing I will say is, besides Yakonis from Illinois, I do think that Bryson Tucker could have the opportunity to really impress. I don't think he'll have the minutes, though, to be a freshman player of the year. Shot. I think Malik Renew is going to have to be on my second team. I do think he's going to be the heart and soul of this Hoosier, what's supposed to be a revival, kind of a cathartic experience. That's what I think a lot of Hoosier fans are hoping for this year. And I do think he'll find as well in the second team. I think he will average over 14 or 15 a game and have some key moments.
Joe, I also have him in my second team, but I do have a couple of other players in it. I do have Umar Ballo on the first team. Sorry, I'm just getting these in there for the YouTube viewers. And I have Renew in the second team, and I also have Miles Rice, the transfer from Washington State, in the second team. I think he's going to be allowed to rock. He did his thing last year. He had an incredible season coming off of a cancer-related situation, and I think he's going to be the missing piece for the Hoosiers to get across the line. And Umar Ballo is about as sure thing as it gets to a walking double-double. He might only average 11 and 11, but he's going to get a serious amount of double-digit games. So, Joe, unless you have anything to add for the Hoosiers, we will move on to the third team that starts with an I.
I'm all good, Sean.
All right. That leaves us with... Well, did not come up right. That leaves us with Fran McCaffrey and the Iowa Hawkeyes. They do return their main three players from a team that did not make the tournament a year ago. That would be Peyton Samford, Josh Dix, and Owen Freeman. But after that, Joe, they have not brought anybody significant in the door and just a couple of other role players returning. Where do you see this year going for Iowa?
Sean, I think the expectation should be that this team gets back into the NCAA tournament. Now, that's what the fans expect. That's what the fans want. The fact Fran hasn't been to the second weekend yet really irks them. I don't think this is the team to do it, but I do think this team has the capability to get back into the tourney because of those big three you just mentioned, Dix, Sanford, and Owen Freeman. I think it relies heavily on Owen Freeman having that big sophomore jump we think he's capable of having. We saw it in flashes last year, but I do think, I really think it's going to rely a lot on him. I think that guy is someone who can score 30 a game or can score 3 a game, and I think perhaps the truth will lie in the middle there, which is why a lot of people have him projected averaging 12, 14 a game. Sean, I think Peyton Samford's the obvious choice when we do talk about awards. That guy is straight money from the three-point line. I really think if he's off, Iowa's going to be in huge trouble in a lot of games. Although the good news for Iowa fans, as they know, is that's not very often.
Yeah, so Joe, it's going to be more the same for the Hawkeyes in terms of scoring a lot of points and letting in a lot of points. They are 15th in offensive efficiency predicted and 92nd in defense. So that is about where they've been over the past 3 years, and it looks like that's going to be more of the same. They don't have a terrible non-conference schedule. They just play that Cy-Hawk game. Really is the only one of note, and that will be at home. They have Utah on a neutral and Washington State on a neutral, but still just the one game against a top 50 team in non-conference. Now, there will be plenty of opportunities in the Big Ten for good wins, but they might not be tested early on, so they might be able to iron some things out, get the offense rolling, and we'll see where they have them. So I'll go first for Iowa, Joe. I do think that it's going to be more of the same in a bad way for the Hawkeyes, and I have them finishing in 15th in the conference. What about you?
Don, I don't have it that far up. I do think their ceiling's a lot higher. I think they're going to upset and piss off a lot of teams at home. And although Iowa's not the greatest road team in the country, I don't think anyone's going to make the case. There are 3 games a year where Iowa will shoot the lights out on the road, albeit that's not sustainable, but it's going to happen. With that said, I do think they finish in 13th. Uh, I don't think it's a great finish. I don't think that's a finish that would get them into the tournament unless this conference uh, is really stacked. So Iowa in 13th, although I do think Sean.
Yep, I agree, Joe. I think it'll be inconsistent, and at the very best, I think that's middle of the pack in this conference. Now, that might be enough to make the tournament in this day and age, but I'm going to tend to think that it's not, and I think they will miss out again. I've got Sanford on my second team. He was pretty close to the cutoff for me about making the first team, but I do think if they're not very good, then that will hurt his cause for getting on that first team. So I'm going to go with Sanford to the second team.
Sean, I'm going to disagree. I think Sanford is on the first team. I think his scoring production alone, especially for how important he is going to land him there. I do think, sorry about the beeping in the background, guys. I do think an Owen Freeman can pop off and be a dark horse first or second teamer. I don't think that's likely, but if any guy in the conference can make that year 1 to 2 jump, I think he's probably one of the top 2 or 3 candidates.
Joe, sorry, they just reset, the software just reset on me, so I do have to do this again. But I think that's going to be good. The power rankings weren't filling up as I was doing them, but all right. So you've got Sanford on the first team. I have got him on the second team. Anybody else from Iowa, Joe?
I don't think so.
Just
Sanford.
I think maybe one of their other big 3 can get a second team if they do end up being pretty good, but I don't see that happening. So I'm not going to put another name on the list. All right, Joe, we move to the M schools now, and we are going in alphabetical order. And so you can just scroll down the left there on the screen. You can see them. And we are going to College Park, Maryland. Kevin Willard and the Terrapins in year 3. A disappointing year ago, but they do bring in highly ranked transfer Jacoby Gillespie, and they do bring in highly ranked freshman Derek Queen. Julian Reese returns along with Sean Harris-Smith. Is it safe to say there's a little bit of sneaky optimism in the Maryland camp right about now?
Yeah, and hopefully, unlike his counterpart Mike Loxley, I think that optimism at media day is rooted in good faith. I do think Julian Reese returning is huge. I think getting Gillespie, even getting it at Derek Queen, I think that's fine, but I don't think it emphasizes the importance enough of a Deshaun Harris-Smith, who they also bring back. So this is kind of similar to Iowa, not in terms of style of play, not in terms of anything else other than Julian Reese is really going to have to carry this team on his back, whether that's leadership off the court, leadership on the court, whatever. I think he's going to be a guy that's going to really be important to Maryland's culture. I think year 3 under Kevin Willard, this is as important a year as it gets. I think year 1, he completely blew us out of the park, overperformed. Year 2, maybe the expectations were a little unfairly high. I do think they played well in certain games, although, Sean, the January and February they had was there was nothing other than pathetic. I think Kevin Willard would even tell you that. I think now he has guys that are more comfortable in that position. I do think having a Derek Queen in there with all these other guys who've been in the program or been in college basketball for at least a year or 2 is going to help. Sean, I find it really hard to believe that Maryland's going to be a top team in this conference, though I'm also finding it hard to believe that they're going to be toward the cellar of it either.
Yeah, I do have them slightly above middle of the pack. I can't see them getting probably better than like a 7 seed in the NCAA tournament, but they're going to be good enough where they're not going to be out of the middle of the pack. Like, they're probably going to win at least 8 games in the conference, and they do have a pretty tough non-conference schedule with the likes of Marquette, Villanova, Syracuse. So if you can win a couple of those, you don't need a great conference season to make the dance, and I think they will. It's not going to be the prettiest style of basketball, but that has tended to work in this conference over the years. They're 74th in offense, 17th in defense, and if there's one thing for sure, that Kevin Willard can coach a team on the defensive end. So you get a couple of those offensive players clicking, and you're going to win some ball games. So, Joe, I have got Maryland in the 6th spot in the power rankings.
Wow. I didn't expect them that high for you, Sean. I do have them at 9th. I do think they're the ultimate barrier between the middle class and upper class of this conference. I think Maryland, I do think the road record and home record they had in 22 and 23 can be translated. I think they win most of their games at home, and I think they get killed a lot on the road, which was probably going to equate them in 9th place.
All right, Joe, adding anybody to the list for all conference?
Sean, I am, and I'm going to run out of spots on my second team, unfortunately, but I feel like I would be in bad faith if I left Julian Reese off of the second team. I do think he has a really good year. I think kind of a bounce-back year based on the expectations he had last year. Give me Julian Reese as my third guy on that second team.
All right, Joe, I've got a different Maryland player on my second team. I think it's Jacoby Gillespie, the Belmont transfer. He's going to have to do a lot as their lead guard. He has shot the ball really well in the past. He's won games in the past, and with Queen, I don't think him playing with Reese is going to happen a lot because it's not that going to be that pretty. So I think there might be sort of a platoon situation there. Maybe even if it's just 30-10. I think Reese's stats could suffer just a little bit. Now, it would be great if they both work because they're both going to be good players, but that's why I gave Gillespie the nod in that department. So, Joe, I think we're good to move on to the next team.
All good.
All right. Up next, just up the road from you, Joe, the Michigan State Spartans. Tom Izzo is back for yet another season at the helm, still with Purdue losing last year, the last time a Big Ten team won the national title. You get a number of names out of the door in Lansing, but Jaden Akins, Xavier Booker, Jeremy Fierce, Trey Holloman return. You get highly touted transfer Frankie Fiddler in the door from Omaha. Cohen Carr is back as well. And then you get two highly ranked freshmen in Jace Richardson and Kerr Tang. So, Joe, Michigan State, they've had a number of kind of okay seasons in a row. Is it headed for another one?
Sean, I find it hard to believe the script of Michigan State loses significant non-conference games, picks off 1 of 5, stumbles in January, stumbles in early February, then puts it together in March and has everyone believing they're in the Sweet 16. I think that script's just been on repeat ever since Cassius Winston left. That's kind of it's kind of just in constant repeat. I don't know if the universe is playing a sick joke on them or playing a sick joke on all of us because I can't see anything different. I think this team is a lot less, let's put it, under scrutiny or under the microscope. Last year, being the 4th ranked team in the country, a team that since opening night was heavily scrutinized, heavily criticized. Losing to James Madison, albeit that James Madison team was great in the NCAA tournament. From then on, I think Michigan State felt that every wrong move they made would be magnified. This year's team, not really so much, Sean. I think there's more veteran leadership. I do think Jaden Akins back is huge. He's often been criticized, but I think toward the end of last year, he really picked up his game. He really shot the 3 better. It's totally dependent where Michigan State finishes on Xavier Booker and Jeremy Fierce Jr.'s development. I think both of those guys are supremely talented. They were borderline 5-stars, or one was a clear 5-star in Booker, for very valid reasons. I think Booker not playing in the beginning of last year might not have been the worst thing for him. I do think he developed toward the end. I really think if Michigan State could find some kind of answer to their down low issues, especially if Booker gets in foul trouble, it's a Carson Cooper or Jackson Kohler, 2 guys who've been effective in spurts but not really on a consistent basis. I think that could be the answer. I think Trey Holloman and Frankie Fiddler are going to be solid role players, but this team needs stars, and I think Jaden Akins is one. And if they get a second one, whether it's Booker or Fears, I think the conference should be on very high alert.
Yeah, I kind of like how this puzzle fits, Joe, and I have kind of said the opposite over the years to Michigan State. They've had a number of players who've been good, but who've also been bad, and you know, it couldn't really just have a good game at the same time. Akins is a solid player. Fiddler is a solid player. He scored a lot of points. Now, it wasn't the Summit League, but there's been other Summit League players who have come into the big leagues and done well. So I think Fiddler actually is near the top in their scoring. And I think if one of those two sophomores that you mentioned can get to that 11 to 12 points a game mark, they can have a pretty solid three of Akins, Fiddler, and Fears or Booker, maybe even both of them. But I think you play Kansas in the Champions Classic here in early November, but you have Colorado on a neutral, Florida Atlantic at home. I mean, it's not a crazy non-conference schedule for the Spartans. Now, I do think that Colorado is a MTE, but so maybe a one or two other big games in there, but potentially not as many landmines early on, where you'll be a 5-3 but ranked 24th in the country. So I kind of like Michigan State this year, and this is the fifth team, so we'll go back to you first for the power rankings.
Yeah, Sean, I really think Michigan State is going to have an up and down year, not necessarily a terrible year, just their typical flirtation with the 25 and up to 15. That's normally what they do in the months of January through March. Michigan State, give me them in fourth place. I really like this team. I really don't like this pattern that they seem to be on. Although I will say, I think Jaden Akins is the steady hand, and I do think if one of Booker or Fears gets to the point where they're scoring 12, 13 a game, and then you get a surprise like a Frankie Fiddler, I do think this team can win the conference. But as of now, give me them in fourth place. I think the Spartans have a bounce back year, and I think by March we're talking about them as a team that can is more likely than not able to make the Sweet 16.
Yeah, I have them in fourth also, Joe. I think, you know, the team in third is going to be pretty obvious for me, and they're probably first for you. I do think there is a drop off after that spot, but, Joe, that in the age of the 18-team Big Ten, where there might be 10 bids, even like a bad version of this Michigan State team probably goes 9-11, 8-12, and with the goodwill that they've built up with the committee, like they'll be in if they're close.
Absolutely.
And I just think now, spoiler alert for the next part, I don't have any players in my first or second team, but I do think they have 4 or 5 solid players who could sneak into that second team. But no star, maybe one breaks out, but I don't have any other players in there, but I still like Michigan State to have a good year.
Yeah, I think Akins is the leader of this team. I don't think he will be a first or second team player. That's not to say that he's not talented enough nor capable enough to do that. I think the way they'll play and the way they're going to rely on one of these sophomores is going to take away some of his stats and some of his shots. But I do think if they had to ride Akins, if one of those guys are injured or they're out for whatever reason, I think he does have the capabilities to do that.
So nobody for Michigan State for you?
No one for the Spartans, though.
Okay. All right, Joe. They're playing in football this weekend or today, or no, tomorrow by the time that you've seen this. Michigan, Dusty May comes into town from FAU, a very different roster from a year ago, and I mean that in the best way possible. Roddy Gale, Vlad Golden, Danny Wolf, Trey Donaldson, and Reuben Jones highlight the incomings. Namari Burnett and Will Shetter return. I think we've talked about this over the late spring there, Joe. They probably are one really good player short of being a really good team, but still, what are the expectations for Dusty in year one in Ann Arbor?
Yeah, I think, and I'm just going to answer the part I just missed. I think unlike your rivals up north, expectations are a lot less. That's not to say, like, Michigan State's expectations are clearly to hang a banner again. That doesn't mean a national title, probably more of a Big Ten tournament title or to get back to the second weekend. and make a run deep into March. Michigan doesn't have those kind of expectations. Their main expectation is to get back to March, period. I think a round of 64 is going to not make fans happy and joyous, but probably just show that the program's in the right direction. The way they played this past Sunday against Oakland, albeit Oakland's lost a lot of their talent, particularly a Trey Townsend and a Josh Golke. Did I pronounce that right?
Yeah, yeah.
Yeah, I think that's I think the way they played and the multiple ways they can beat you is something Michigan's going to exploit a lot in a lot of these games. I don't think they're going to win this conference. I do think this roster and team, but especially with the veteran presence, I think Roddy Gale's going to score a lot. I think Vlad Golden's going to clean up a lot of messes and bail them out, for lack of a better term, in a lot of situations. I think between those two guys, Gale, Golden, and similar to Michigan State, if they can find a third star, whether that's an Amari Burnett, Trey Donaldson, or maybe it's a surprising freshman like a Lorenzo Cason, or even the transfer Reuben Jones, who didn't even start at North Texas. I think there's so many ways this team can beat you, and I think for the first time they have 8 guys who all legitimately could start, but 8 guys who are going to see significant time, and a sharpshooter in Sam Walters. This team has to be so excited just to watch them,
Yeah,
let alone predict them.
they should have at least enough depth early on to sort of figure out who is good and who's not, because they're, I mean, other than Golden, like, is there a sure good player, like a really good player on this team? I think there's a lot of good players, but I think you'll definitely be figuring things out early on in the season. I still do think you're probably one like scoring guard short of being
Jameer Watkins, yeah.
Of a top 25 team, but there's no reason that Dusty cannot take this bunch to the tournament in year one. And Joe, we'll go to you first for this one. Where do you have the Wolverines?
Give me my Michigan Wolverines in 7th place. I think they're going to. I think they're going to be. There's going to be a lot of patterns. I think they're going to win a lot. I think they're going to win one and lose one more often than not. I think they're going to have some trouble on the road. I do think the early part of their schedule is really difficult, and we'll have them battle tested by the time Big Ten play, consistent Big Ten play from January to March comes around. I like the fact that I really like the fact that they're playing 6 premier non-conference games. Of those 6, even if they win 2 of those and don't pick up a bad loss, something they have not done in the last 2 years, by the way, 2 of those 6 without a bad loss could have them in a really good position for March. So Wolverines in 7th place. Really excited to see this team. And Sean, I think it's not far-fetched to think this team can get to 20 wins on the year.
Joe, I do have them a couple of pegs lower, but I do think that their spot is the cutoff for NCAA tournament teams. I've got Michigan in 10th, but I do think that that is enough in this day and age to make the tournament. Maybe it's a first 4, especially if, Michigan play all these tough games, win half of them, get blown out in a few, like have a ton of different numbers all over the place, that sort of team just gets thrown in Dayton for the first 4. And it's been Michigan State a lot, and it's, a number of A10 teams that are high that have really good numbers, but not a lot of good wins. So I think Michigan is going to the first 4. That's my first bold prediction of this season, really. And I do think that that's probably a position that Michigan fans will take at this point, getting back to the tournament. That does count as the tournament if you make the first 4. And I do think their ceiling might not be, as high as it could have been, but I do think the floor is definitely higher than a lot of these teams, because Dusty is really good coach, and you've got a couple players who've won a lot of basketball games on this roster. So, Joe, any players that you're adding to your list for the conference teams?
I'm going to have my first surprise. I'm going to have Vlad Golden, Michigan star center, the center from Russia, I might add. Give me him on the first team as the first team center. I really think at FAU he played very well against good competition. You can tell me all you want how FAU's in a worse league. They've been in 2 worse leagues than the Big Ten. But when the lights were brightest, especially the NCAA tournament, the guy showed out. And I don't think he's going to back down from this level of competition. I do think he's gotten better in his mid-range. Something he won't do a lot, but something that he's not going to be afraid to do if they do take away his post game.
And Joe, with the exception of Indiana, I do think Michigan has probably got the second best front court in this league between Wolf and Golden. And I do think Ballo and Renew are probably better, but
Totally.
Golden is a really good player. He's played hundreds, maybe not hundreds, more than 100 college basketball games. And Danny Wolf, too, is someone who really is going to surprise. I've seen him play a number of times over the years at Yale, and he is really tough to guard because he's a quicker, I think, stretch four in the Big Ten, but he played the five at Yale, and remember they did beat Bruce Pearl's Auburn last year. So for me, there was one spot in the second team for a Michigan player, and I did go with Golden over Wolf, but I do think those are your two best players, and I wouldn't be surprised if either one are, in the conference teams at the end of the year. So, Joe, that's Michigan. I've got him in 10th. You've got him in 7th. We both have Vlad Golden on A, all-conference team. And we'll move on to Minnesota. All right, let me just get my notes here for Minnesota. Ben Johnson is back from Minnesota for another year. Dawson Garcia also returns. They do lose a couple players to the transfer portal, especially Elijah Mitchell, I think his name is. And other than that, Joe, not a lot to write home about this Minnesota Golden Gophers. Serious lack of talent up in Minnesota.
Yeah, Sean, I think the year they had last year was encouraging, but then you lose all this talent. And even though Jamison Battle wasn't on the team last year, this is becoming a disturbing trend where one of their top two players transfers, even under
It's
Richard
Hawkins,
Pitino.
not Mitchell. My bad. Elijah Hawkins.
Yeah, Hawkins. And then even losing it, this is a Richard Pitino era one, so please roll your eyes all you want. Even losing a Marcus Carr, that's a Minnesota basketball fan. Like, how are you not going to watch their hockey team instead of their basketball team? I mean, that's just ridiculous. And I don't know if it's an NIL problem, and I don't want to speak out of an area of my body that I shouldn't be speaking out of, but that seems to me to be a theme across administration. So I think that's something they do have to figure out. Sean, I'm not very confident in this team. I think Dawson Garcia is going to have to win games on his own. This is similar to a way Marcus Carr won a lot of games for this team back in the day. Because, Sean, who else on this team can you really trust? I'm hard-pressed to find one. Perhaps you could trust Mike Mitchell Jr. He was very good for them last year. He's really good at moving the ball around. But other than that, Sean, there's no other way to put it. I think this is a basement seller team in the Big Ten. What do you say? What do you say?
Yeah, I've got them one spot off the floor in 17th. I do think Dawson Garcia might lead the conference in scoring. And that's about it. I think there's one team that's worse than them, and that's about all the good things I can say about the Gophers. But where do you have them?
Sean, I have them in the cellar.
All right. So I do think the team that you probably have in 17th is the team that I have in 18th. But two more teams for us today as we get through the top 9 in the Big Ten. Joe, that leaves us with the two schools that start with an N. We're going to Fred Hoiberg and, well, let's stop there. Do you have Dawson Garcia on either team?
Second team.
Second
absolutely.
team. All right, I actually left him off. I just think that they're going to be really bad, and I do think that, unfortunately, will cause him to lose some votes that he probably should. He's definitely in the top 14 players in the conference, but I do think some other players deserved a look over him. Now we're going to Fred Hoiberg's Nebraska. A serious step up for them getting to the NCAA tournament for the first time ever, pretty much. They do lose a number of talented players from a year ago. Keisei Tominaga has graduated. Rink Mast is redshirting this year because of a knee injury, so he will be back next year for the Huskers. But, Joe, you've had one of the best seasons in your program's history. Is it inevitable that a backward step is coming?
Yeah, this is something that Chris Collins has dealt with multiple times at Northwestern, especially after the first dance they had, where they brought back not every piece, but a decent amount of the pieces they had on that 2017 team. I think Nebraska's going to have to deal with that. I think it's not as dire as Minnesota, where your goal isn't to finish in one of the last two spots, although should Nebraska suffer an injury, I think it could be catastrophic because of the lack of pieces on this team. I do want to highlight they do have a Connor Seachin, they have an Aaron Eulis. guys they've brought in, but I don't see it any other way, Sean. I do think this team is going to struggle. I think Fred Hoiberg is a really phenomenal coach. I do think if there's any premier job that he should always be up for it, although I doubt he would take it after the way he's moved around in the past decade. Nebraska, oof. I look at this non-conference schedule. You have a St. Mary's, you have away at Creighton. There's not a lot of opportunities for great wins. I do think you're in danger if you do lose one of these dumb games, like a Fairleigh Dickinson, a Bethune-Cookman at home. Not a lot of opportunity to prove themselves, especially against Creighton, who I think will blow them out of the water in Omaha. So I think they're just going to have to play spoiler a lot this year, and maybe that gets them hot near the Big Ten tournament.
Yeah, what's screaming out to me here is a serious lack of depth. I mean, Bryce Williams and Juwan Gary are solid players, but other than that, you haven't really had anybody who's been a solid rotation player on any team. Griffiths and Esijan were sort of role player, trick play, sort of 3-point shooters, and maybe they can be solid with more minutes. But, Joe, the top of the line is all right, but after that, I do think that they are going to lose a lot of games this year. Now, Fred Hoiberg is as good as an offensive coach as the Underwoods and the McCaffreys. They scored a lot of points last year, but there's just not a ton of weapons here. So I tend to think that it'll be a step back for Nebraska. Nothing like horrendous, but I do think they're probably under 500. Certainly under 500 in the Big Ten, and I have them down in 14th.
Don, I have them one spot lower at 15th. I don't think this is a reflection of Fred Hoiberg more so than the roster and situation they're in. I do think Nebraska fans, I mean, geez, if you've seen their football program since 2011 or 2014 rather, patience is a virtue they do have, albeit it's not something that they should have to deal with for this long.
And I'm assuming, Joe, no players on either team for you?
No, if one does make it, that would be one of the surprises of the year.
Yeah, and it's going to have to be a sort of heroic effort to 7 or 8 win season in my mind. But, Nebraska can be that's sort of the game that maybe the new teams don't do very well in. And in Lincoln, that arena, Pinnacle Bank, weirder things have happened. A couple of those bad Nebraska teams almost beat Purdue in there once they did. So, at the end of the day, that could be a spoiler. But other than that, I do think it's going to be a season with a number of L's for Nebraska. All right, Joe, the last one for part one up here is potentially one of the most polarizing teams in the Big Ten, and that is Northwestern. Chris Collins is back for another year, and the best player in program history, Boo Buie, has graduated and run out of eligibility. Certainly his impact cannot be overstated, but they do return a lot of solid players from that team last year that made it to the round of 32. Brooks Barnheiser is back. Ty Berry is back. Nick Martinelli, Justin Mullins, Matthew Nicholson, Luke Hunger, Blake Smith. You've got pretty much the full deck other than the second best player in the conference back for this year for Chris Collins.
Yeah, Sean, and I think Brooks Barnheiser is the guy that's going to be highlighted a lot. He's been in every article you click on about Northwestern basketball, along with Ty Berry, a guy who's almost automatic from three-point land. I think this year he's going to have to be that and more for them to win a lot of these games. Expectation-wise, I don't think making the tournament again is out of the realm of possibility. I think playing meaningful games in March and having it go from there should be a realistic expectations for the Wildcats. I think Chris Collins has bought himself over a decade of fooling around in Evanston, especially with the way their athletic program has continued to invest in their facilities and whatnot. I do think they believe in him. I think through athletic directors, they've also the one consistent factor that's been there. It's not been Pat Fitzgerald after that scandal. It's been Chris Collins. I think he's kind of becoming the face of Northwestern. I think he's been comfortable doing that. I do think he's going to be a Northwestern lifer. I don't see him leaving there anytime soon, if ever. So I think they are what they are. I think they're going to be a really solid team. I think they're going to give teams a lot of problems. I think one issue I'm going to have is Welsh Ryan and wherever they play, it's not all that intimidating. I'm going to be really honest, Sean. it's tough to play there, but I think it's tough to play there because of the teams Northwestern's had the last 2 years. It's not tough to play there because of the fans or the ruckus environment. Let's face the facts here. Due to that, I do think they drop uh, some silly games at home, although they will provide plenty of issues for teams on the road. So don't think I'm chalking Northwestern up for the dead here. Sean, you're going to be stunned by this. I actually have Northwestern at 12th.
Okay. Yeah, I've got them in ninth, a couple places higher. They do also add Fairfield transfer Jalen Leach, and I'm a lot more familiar with him than I am most transfers. He's a really high-level, three-level scorer. He dealt with injuries his first 3 years, but his senior year was awesome. He should have been the conference player of the year, and Blanc from Quinnipiac won it instead, but Leach was a better player than him. Now, here is the thing. If Northwestern is expecting him to be the point guard, that's going to be a new role for him. He was pretty much the 3 for his Fairfield career. And maybe Barry's the point guard, but he's not a point guard, and then Barnhizer certainly not. So if they kind of shoehorn Leach into the point guard spot, which may be his only way of starting, that's not something that he's done before. Now, Chris Collins deserves the benefit of the doubt for trying something out like this, but you've got 3 great guards. None of them are point guards. I tend to think that maybe one of them doesn't start and comes off the bench, and that will be Leach. He will be the one who comes off the bench, but certainly a storyline that I'm a little bit more familiar with than most people, and it's a big question for me early on in this season. But, Joe, they do have Dayton on the road in Game 2. That's going to be a big one. Dayton's Absolutely. A good team this year. If they can win that one, that is probably or they play Butler in their MTE in a neutral, but, they've never really scheduled all that tough in the non-conference. That's not different this year. And, Joe, what you said about Welsh Ryan, they have actually, I think, won more road games in this conference than any other team recently. And when they were the 2 seed, they won more road games than home games, which is incredibly impressive. So if you can shore up your home form a little bit, you can make the tournament. And I have them 9th. I do think they make it. And I'm guessing in 12th, I think they're probably on the outside.
I think they're on the
looking
border.
In.
They're right on the border.
Yeah. And who knows? Maybe if a 7-13 seed in the Big Ten wins 2 really good non-conference games, that might be enough. It really will be interesting with the SEC and the Big 12 so big, what happens here. But, Joe, I'm assuming you have a couple of ads here to your teams for Northwestern.
Nope, here's another eyebrow raiser for some people, but I think people who appreciated Northwestern basketball the way we have aren't going to be stunned by this. I have Brooks Barnhizer as the 3rd guy on my first team.
So do I.
Yeah, I knew you would say that.
So, do you have anybody else? Because I don't, but I figured Barnhizer is probably going to be their star, and if they're any good, he's going to receive a lot of praise.
I think Ty Berry's one you could throw out there. I don't think Nick Martinelli is that kind of player. I think Ty Berry's the only other potential. You know a lot more about Jalen Leach than I would, perhaps, but the only one I'd put stock in aside from Barnhizer is Ty Berry.
Yeah, and they were extremely thin at the end of last year with their injuries, and let's hope for their sake that they can avoid that, because they've got 3, potentially 4 really solid players, and that is, as good as any 4 in the conference, I think. They're going to win some games, and 16th in the coaches poll, Joe. Really, really interesting for the Wildcats. We said it when it came out when we reacted to it, but shocked that the coaches don't respect Northwestern after all these years of them probably winning in your building.
Yeah, and I want to make a note of something, Sean. When we do these power rankings and we do these, particularly these where these teams are going to finish, I do think a gap between a Northwestern who I have in 12th and a Maryland who I have in 9th, or even Michigan I have in 7th, I think that could be 1 or 1.5 games. I think the margin of error is so thin. If you told me Michigan, if I fully expected, put my life that they'd come in 7th, and you told me from the future that they came in 12th or 13th, I wouldn't be stunned because it's probably a 1 or 2 game delta.
We've talked about how close it's been over the years. That's just going to get even closer with more teams. And tiebreakers. Remember that last day of the season 2 years ago, Joe, when Indiana and Michigan were playing, and if Indiana won, they were the 2 seed in the conference tournament, and if they lost, they were the 8 seed. One game different. That's just how close it's going to be. It will be interesting to see how close it is, whether like the 7th ranked team doesn't make the tournament, for example, and 13 does. It's one game different and a different non-conference slate, different big wins, different metrics. You can see something like that, but it will be an interesting year in the Big Ten, that is for sure. We will finish the 9 teams at a later date and our all-conference teams. There's still 4 spots on our first team, and I have 2 spots left on my second team, and Joe, you have 3. So for now, that's all we have. Be sure to tune into our Football in a Nutshell podcast and then part 2 of this when it comes out. Thank you, everybody.